The war ends with noise. Church bells ring. Crowds flood the streets. London glows beneath victory lights, its scars briefly hidden by celebration. People dance among ruins and believe survival itself is proof of strength. The empire stands. The enemy is gone. History, it seems, has chosen a winner. But beneath the cheers, behind boarded windows and bombed facades, another story unfolds in silence. Vault doors close on emptiness. Ledgers replace banners. Accountants begin counting losses that no monument will ever show. The war is over, but the reckoning has only begun. The story most people know is simple and comforting. World War II saved the British Empire. It proved its resilience. It united its people. It preserved its place at the center of the world. That story is repeated because it feels right. Empires fall when they lose wars, not when they win them. Yet history is rarely that clean. Sometimes victory costs more than defeat. Sometimes survival demands payments that reshape the future. This is one of those times. Behind the parades, Britain is exhausted. Its cities are damaged. Its industries are worn down. Its people are tired but proud. The empire still stretches across maps in bold red lines. But power is not measured in color. It is measured in capacity, in reserves, in choices. And Britain's choices are narrowing fast. The war drained not only lives and buildings. It drained money, gold, and leverage. The empire stands tall, but it is leaning on something new. Think about that. An empire that ruled oceans and currencies did not collapse on the battlefield. It did not fall to invasion. It did not surrender. It bled out quietly in ledgers, contracts, and temporary agreements that were never meant to last. The battlefield decided survival. The balance sheet decided dominance. Those two outcomes were not the same. During the war, Britain fought for its existence. It needed ships, fuel, food, steel, and weapons. It needed them fast and in impossible quantities. Every convoy that arrived kept factories running and people fed. Every shipment delayed collapse by another week, another month. At first, Britain paid its way. Gold crossed the Atlantic. Overseas assets were sold. Investments built over generations were liquidated in months. Survival demanded sacrifice, and Britain paid willingly. But war burns money faster than any empire can replace it. Bombers destroy cities in minutes. Rebuilding takes decades. Armies consume resources without producing anything in return. Trade shrinks. Insurance vanishes. Shipping lanes turned deadly. As the war dragged on, Britain's reserves thinned. Gold stocks fell. Foreign investments disappeared. What once seemed vast now looked finite. The empire was discovering the cost of total war. This is where the story shifts. Not with an explosion, but with an agreement. Not with a battle, but with a signature. While Britain fought, the United States applied. Factories across the Atlantic roared to life. Ships left ports heavy with goods. On the surface, this looked like friendship, like solidarity, like democracy standing together against a common threat. And it was, in part, but it was also something else. The United States was not fighting on its own soil. Its cities were intact. Its industries were expanding. Its workforce was growing. War for America was destruction abroad and production at home. While Britain spent, America earned. While Britain liquidated, America accumulated. This imbalance mattered. It created a quiet asymmetry in the alliance, one that would grow with every passing year. Aid did not arrive without structure. Supplies moved under systems that tracked value, repayment, and future obligation. Emergency measures were framed as temporary. Everyone said so. The language was reassuring. No one talked about control. No one talked about consequences. In wartime, the focus is survival, not terms. Yet those terms were there, written carefully, waiting for peace to make them unavoidable. In dim rooms filled with cigarette smoke and marked-up maps, decisions were made that shifted power without firing a shot. Shipping lanes were not just military routes. They were economic arteries. Currency arrangements were not technical details. They were statements about the future. Each compromise felt small. Each concession felt necessary. Taken together, they formed a new reality. Dollars began to replace sterling. At first, this seemed practical. Sterling had dominated trade for decades, but war disrupted trust. Dollars were backed by American production and untouched reserves. They moved easily across borders. They bought what was needed now. Convenience became habit. Habit became dependence. Currency is not just a medium of exchange. It is a claim on the future. And Britain was slowly surrendering that claim. Loans replaced sovereignty in subtle ways. Borrowing allowed Britain to keep fighting without immediate collapse. It preserved appearances. The empire still governed. The flag still flew. But borrowed survival comes with strings. Every loan narrows a range of possible decisions. Every obligation shifts power toward the creditor. In wartime, these shifts feel invisible. In peace, they become unavoidable. Emergency aid has a way of becoming permanent. What begins as a bridge becomes a foundation. Britain told itself that recovery would restore balance, that trade would resume, that sterling would recover, that the empire would pay its way again. These assumptions rested on a world that no longer existed. The war had changed markets, production, and expectations. The center of gravity was moving, whether Britain wanted it to or not. By the time the guns fell silent, the empire was still standing. but it was no longer standing on its own feet. Its finances were intertwined with another power's priorities. Its currency faced competition it could not control. Its choices were shaped by obligations written during moments of desperation. Victory had preserved the state, but it had transformed the system. This transformation did not feel like defeat. There were no surrender ceremonies. No foreign troops marched through London. Instead, there were meetings, negotiations, press releases that spoke of partnership and reconstruction. The language of empire gave way to the language of cooperation. It sounded modern. It sounded reasonable. It masked the loss of autonomy behind promises of stability. Once an empire's money is controlled, everything else follows. Military reach depends on budgets. Administration depends on revenue. Influence depends on credit. Britain can still command respect, but respect without resources fades. Power is not what others believe about you. It is what you can do when belief runs out. This is a story about dependence disguised as alliance, about help that quietly rewrote the global order. It is about how survival can carry a price higher than collapse. And it begins not with the fall of an empire, but with its apparent triumph. Because sometimes the most important turning points arrive wearing the mask of victory. Before the war, the British Empire looked unbreakable. Its reach felt natural, almost permanent, like the tides it once ruled. Ships stitched oceans together with scheduled certainty. Goods moved outward and inward in predictable flows. Raw materials traveled toward factories. Finished products traveled back to the world. Insurance, finance, and trade all passed through the same narrow gateway. London was not just a capital. It was a command center for the global economy. Sterling sat at the heart of that system. It was trusted, accepted, and familiar. Contracts were written in it. Reserves were held in it. Entire regions depended on it for stability. To trade with the empire was to trade in sterling, and to trade in sterling was to accept London's rules. This was power without spectacle. No armies were required to enforce it. Money did the work quietly. From Indian textile mills to African mines, resources moved toward the center like clockwork. Colonial economies were not designed to compete with Britain. They were designed to feed it. Railways ran from interior regions to ports, not between local markets. Crops were grown for export, not resilience. Wealth flowed outward, then upward, into financial institutions that converted resources into influence. It was an efficient system, and efficiency creates confidence. Even as war clouds gathered, Britain believed the system could endure. It had survived global conflict before. It had weathered crises. It had allies, colonies, and experience. On paper, the empire still controlled enormous wealth. Its maps showed security. Its traditions suggested permanence. The assumption was simple. Systems that have always worked will keep working. On the surface, the machinery kept running. Factories hummed. Ports stayed busy. Newspapers spoke of resolve and unity. The public saw strength because strength was what the empire projected best. Behind the curtain, however, stress fractures were forming. War exposed dependencies that peace had hidden. The system was strong, but it was not flexible. Trade routes were vulnerable. The oceans that once guaranteed control now carried danger. Submarines turned shipping lanes into liabilities. Insurance costs soared. Delays became common. Every lost ship was not just a military setback. It was an economic wound. Imports slowed. Exports shrank. The empire's arteries narrowed under pressure. Gold reserves were finite. They always are. Britain had relied on gold as a foundation of trust, a promise behind its currency. In war, that gold began to move. It crossed oceans to pay for supplies. It was exchanged for fuel, food, and steel. Each shipment solved an immediate problem and created a future one. Gold does not regenerate. Once spent, it must be earned back. War burned money faster than any peacetime economy could replace it. Armies consume without producing. Bombing destroys capital instantly. Skilled workers leave factories for uniforms. Productivity falls while costs explode. Even a global empire cannot outpace that math forever. Britain was discovering that scale does not guarantee sustainability. Still, the illusion held. The empire looked rich because it controlled so much. It looked stable because it had ruled so long. Appearances are powerful. They shape decisions. They delay panic. They encourage risk. Britain continued operating as if recovery was inevitable, as if peace would restore the old rhythms. That belief drove choices that made sense emotionally but weakened leverage financially. Behind the scenes, Britain was selling assets quietly. Overseas investments were liquidated. Stakes in railways, utilities, and companies were exchanged for cash. These assets had taken generations to accumulate. They represented long-term income and influence. Selling them provided short-term relief at long-term cost. Survival demanded it, but the price was future control. Credit was stretched to its limit. Temporary measures became routine. What was once unthinkable became normal. Budgets assumed borrowing. Plans assumed repayment later. The empire was not collapsing. It was coasting on momentum. And momentum hides weakness better than strength ever could. Momentum creates the illusion of choice. As long as things move forward, decisions feel voluntary. Britain believed it was choosing to borrow, choosing to sell, choosing to adapt. In reality, options were shrinking. Each action closed doors that could not be reopened easily. Each compromise reduced independence by degrees too small to alarm anyone at the time. especially when survival depends on imports. Britain could not feed itself fully. It relied on global supply chains for food, fuel, and raw materials. War disrupted those chains at every level. Domestic production could not replace them quickly. Geography, once an advantage, became a constraint. An island nation must trade to live. Weapons followed the same logic. Modern war required industrial output at a scale Britain could no longer meet alone. Aircraft, vehicles, ammunition, and machinery demanded resources and capacity that had been diverted, damaged, or destroyed. The empire could fight bravely, but bravery does not manufacture steel. The war forced Britain to turn outward for support. This was not ideological. It was mathematical. There was only one nation capable of supplying everything at the scale required. One economy with intact infrastructure, expanding production, and surplus capacity. The United States did not just have what Britain needed. It had more than it needed. Dependence changes relationships, even among allies. When one side needs more than it can give, balance shifts. Negotiations become asymmetrical. Priorities diverge. What begins as cooperation gradually becomes accommodation. Britain did not feel this shift immediately. The urgency of war masked it, but it was there, shaping outcomes quietly. The empire's confidence rested on history, not current reality. It remembered past dominance and assumed continuity. Yet systems that endure for centuries can fail quickly when conditions change. War accelerated change at a speed institutions were not designed to handle. The old rules still existed, but they no longer explained the world accurately. London remained a financial hub, but activity alone is not power. Power lies in direction, not volume. Capital was moving through London, but control over its terms was weakening. Decisions increasingly depended on external approval, external supply, and external currency. The center was holding, but it was no longer commanding. This was the paradox of wartime Britain. It looked strong while becoming fragile. It projected confidence while surrendering leverage. It fought for survival while mortgaging its future. None of this was inevitable, but much of it was unavoidable. The war did not create these vulnerabilities. It exposed them. By the time victory approached, the empire was already transformed beneath the surface. Its resources were thinner. Its autonomy was constrained. Its recovery would depend not just on effort, but on permission. The illusion of strength had carried it through the war. Peace would test whether illusion could become reality again. It could not. The turning point did not arrive with a battle. It arrived with paperwork. While headlines focus on fronts and offensives, the real shift unfolded in offices where pens mattered more than rifles. Britain's reserves were thinning, and the war was far from over. Each month demanded more fuel, more steel, more food. Each month drained what little remained. Into that gap stepped American aid, framed as partnership and necessity. Ships crossed the Atlantic heavy with supplies, and every crate felt like relief. Yet each shipment carried something else, something less visible. Terms. At first, the language was gentle. Assistance, support, cooperation. It sounded temporary, shaped by emergency. No one spoke of leverage. No one spoke of control. In war, survival silences uncomfortable questions. Britain needed goods immediately, not theoretical independence later. The urgency was real. The choice was stark. Accept help or risk collapse. So agreements were signed, and the machinery of dependence began to turn. Loans replaced gifts. This distinction mattered. A gift ends when it is given. A loan lingers. It follows you into the future. Britain accepted credit because it had to. Payment could wait, but obligation could not. Every borrowed dollar became a future constraint. The empire was buying time, not freedom. Conditions followed quietly. Access came with expectations. Markets were discussed. Trade practices were questioned. Preferential systems that had once favored imperial circulation now looked outdated, even unfair. In the language of reform, long-standing advantages were reframed as obstacles. Britain was asked to adjust, to modernize, to open. Each adjustment seemed reasonable in isolation. Together, they rewrote the rules. Sterling weakened under pressure. War had already strained confidence, but currency strength depends on reserves and trust. Both were eroding. Dollars, backed by untouched industry and expanding output, became more attractive. Suppliers preferred them. Contracts favored them. Britain found itself needing a currency it did not control to keep its economy alive. This was the hidden mechanism at work. Currency leverage. Control the currency, and you control the pace of recovery. Britain could plan rebuilding. Factories could be repaired. Workers could be trained. None of it mattered without the ability to pay for inputs. Raw materials, machinery, and fuel all required dollars. Without them, plans stalled on paper. With them, recovery advanced at a pace set by someone else. Imagine factories ready to rebuild, but unable to buy steel. Imagine ports cleared of rubble but idle for lack of fuel. The empire owned territory, governed populations, and commanded loyalty. Yet ownership without liquidity is fragile. Authority without purchasing power fades quickly. Britain discovered that empire is expensive in peace, not just in war. Each agreement narrowed options. Each extension of credit postponed collapse, while deepening reliance. Emergency measures stretched into peacetime structures. What was once unthinkable became standard procedure. Britain no longer dictated terms. It negotiated within limits defined elsewhere. This was not imposed by force. It was accepted through necessity. The financial center of gravity shifted west quietly. London remained active, but activity does not equal control. Capital flowed, but decisions increasingly responded to external conditions. Britain could advise, persuade, and request. It could no longer compel. That distinction defines power. The war ended, but the emergency did not. Debts remained. Obligations hardened. What had been flexible during conflict became fixed afterward. Credit lines demanded repayment schedules. Agreements demanded compliance. Britain faced a new reality. Winning peace required more money than winning war. Rebuilding cities, restarting industries, and maintaining global commitments cost enormous sums. The empire's income could not match its expenses. Power does not disappear overnight. It erodes, slowly, silently, on paper. Balance sheets tell this story better than speeches. Revenues lag behind costs. Currency pressure persisted. Trade deficits widened. Each indicator pointed in the same direction. Britain was managing decline, not reversing it. The illusion of sovereignty lingered. Flags still flew. Offices still functioned. Diplomacy continued. Yet decision-making space had shrunk. Choices that once belonged solely to London now required consultation. Approval became implicit. Alignment became expected. Independence became conditional. This was not humiliation. It was transformation. Britain was adapting to a world where its historical advantages no longer guaranteed leadership. The empire had been built on trade dominance and financial control. Losing those foundations reshaped everything above them. Military reach became harder to sustain. Administrative costs rose. Colonial management turned into a financial burden rather than a source of profit. Currency leverage did what armies could not. It reordered priorities without violence. It restructured systems without invasion. Britain remained a partner, but partnership now implied asymmetry. The side that controlled liquidity set the tempo. Recovery moved forward, but on terms Britain did not fully write. Every empire believes it can borrow its way through crisis and repay later. That belief assumes the future will resemble the past. Britain assumed trade would rebound, that sterling would recover, that empire would resume paying dividends. The post-war world refused those assumptions. New systems replaced old habits. New centers replaced old hubs. The paperwork of war became the architecture of peace. Agreements signed under pressure defined decades. Institutions formed to stabilize a new order reflected the priorities of those with capital. Britain participated, but participation is not authorship. Influence without veto is limited. The empire discovered that survival had preserved form, not function. It still existed, but it no longer set the rules. Power had migrated through contracts, currencies, and credit. This was not theft. It was succession by accounting. By the time the world spoke openly of rebuilding, Britain's leverage was already spent. The future had been pledged to secure the present. The cost was not immediate collapse, but permanent adjustment. The empire would continue, but smaller, constrained, and increasingly symbolic. The turning point was never dramatic. There was no single moment of loss. Instead, there was accumulation, page after page, signature after signature. The erosion of control happened so gradually that it felt like stability. Only later did the pattern become clear. This is how dominance changes hands in the modern world. Not through conquest, but through credit. Not through defeat, but through dependence. Britain won the war. On paper, it also lost the future. After the victory parades faded, reality moved in quietly. The banners came down. The crowds dispersed. Britain returned to work in cities still scarred by rubble and smoke. Peace did not bring relief. It brought invoices. Rationing continued. Shortages lingered. The sense of triumph slowly gave way to fatigue and calculation. The war was over, but the strain had settled into daily life. Debt now defined the horizon. Wartime borrowing had kept the state alive, but peace exposed its weight. Repayment schedules replaced emergency rhetoric. Currency markets watched closely. Confidence, once assumed, now had to be defended. Sterling faced pressure from every direction. It needed support, credibility, and reserves that no longer existed in sufficient quantity. Britain had won survival, but it had lost comfort. Maintaining an empire became economically irrational. This truth emerged not from ideology, but from arithmetic. Administering distant territories required money, infrastructure, and security. Those costs rose sharply after the war. Revenues did not. Colonial economies that once subsidized the center now demanded investment themselves. Roads, schools, hospitals, and governance all required funding. The empire had become a net expense. One by one, commitments were questioned, not because of rebellion alone, but because balance sheets no longer added up. Influence without profit is difficult to justify in a world of scarcity. Britain faced hard choices: invest at home or abroad, stabilize the currency or maintain far-flung control. These were not moral decisions. They were financial ones. Colonies began to slip away, sometimes through negotiation, sometimes through pressure, sometimes through quiet withdrawal. The narrative often focused on politics and identity, but beneath it all ran money. Independence movements gained leverage because the empire could no longer afford resistance. Withdrawal was cheaper than enforcement. Letting go preserved stability. Holding on risked collapse. This was not retreat in panic. It was disengagement by calculation. Britain adjusted its ambitions to match its resources. The empire transformed into something smaller, looser, and less direct. Flags remained. Ceremonies continued, but control diminished. Influence became symbolic rather than operational. Meanwhile, the United States emerged as a financial architect of the post-war world. It shaped institutions, standards, and systems that reflected its strengths. Rules favored liquidity, open markets, and currency stability anchored elsewhere. This was not declared conquest. It was design. Those who finance recovery often design its framework. London adapted to a new role. It remained important, but no longer central. Experience replaced authority. Tradition replaced command. Britain shifted from ruler to participant. This transition was gradual, but irreversible. The world had learned new habits during the war, and habits hardened quickly. The empire did not fall in flames. It faded under fluorescent lights, across conference tables, in meeting rooms filled with papers and projections. Decisions were calm, measured, and final. The drama of collapse was absent. Instead, there was adjustment, consolidation, and acceptance. This was succession, not conquest. Power passed through banks, not battlefields. The torch moved because capital moved. The future belonged to whoever could finance it. Britain still mattered, but it no longer led by default. Leadership had been decoupled from history and attached to resources. The lesson echoes beyond this story. Global power now rests less on flags and fleets, more on credit currency and access. Military strength matters, but it is expensive. Endurance depends on who can pay when costs accumulate. The nation that underwrites survival often inherits influence. Wars still reshape borders, but economics decides longevity. Victory without financial control is temporary. Survival purchased with debt carries obligations that shape decades. Britain learned this lesson slowly, painfully, and without spectacle. Ask yourself a simple question. When a nation borrows to survive, who really wins? The borrower keeps breathing. The lender shapes the future. This is not cruelty. It is structure. Modern power operates through systems that reward stability and punish dependency. The hidden bill of World War II was not paid in defeat. It was paid in dominance transferred. Britain emerged proud, intact, and diminished. The empire became memory, ceremony, and legacy rather than command. The world did not mourn. It moved on. This story is not about blame. It is about mechanics, about how systems respond to stress, about how survival choices echo long after danger passes. The British Empire did not fail because it was weak. It faded because the world changed faster than its foundations could adapt. Understanding this matters now, because the rules did not disappear. They matured. Power still flows toward those who control liquidity, credit, and trust. The names change. The structures remain. If the story changed how you see history, subscribe for more cinematic explorations of power, money, and the forces that shape our world. And share this with someone who believes wars are won only on battlefields.